Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and this is One-on-One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. This year, we will be taking a topical look at a number of different big ideas as we move along. And this first series that we have is a series of conversations between myself and Tanya White, another Matan faculty member. And we discuss the topic of evil, try and tackle no less than probably one of the biggest theological ideas, topics, struggles that we face in our ancient and modern world. And in these series of conversations, the first of which you'll hear was recorded on Facebook Live, we first discussed the problem itself, the particular challenge that we feel that us moderns are faced with when we think about these topics, when we struggle with disease and challenge and all different types of challenges that we face in our daily life. And as we move along in this series, we'll be talking about more specific topics. We'll be speaking about illness. We'll be speaking about how to think, process, feel through the global pandemic, and other forms of suffering. So stick with us. This first episode, as I said, was recorded on Facebook Live. Stay tuned for the coming episodes. It's great to be back here again on a new season of One-on-One. This season, we're going to be running a number of series, and our first series is between Tanya White and myself, another Matan faculty member, and we'll be discussing different ways of looking at and different responses to question of evil, of dealing with difficulty and challenge in this world. Stay tuned to our upcoming series as well with Dr. Yael Ziegler, and please God, many more to come. But I'm thrilled to kick off this first one with Tanya. Tanya, it's great to have you here.
Great to be here with you again, Yosefa. Been looking forward to getting back.
Me too. Tanya, we both have fathers who have passed away, different circumstances. But if someone would tell us that they died because of their sins, I think both you and I would look at them and think that they were kind of socially off.
Yeah.
It's not really your average response that someone would give after hearing something like that happen. But the fact is that this message, the correlation between death or early death or illness and people's sins, is a message that comes through pretty clearly in a lot of biblical texts and also texts later than that. Plague, illness, national troubles, natural disaster are often presented as a result of sin. The generation of the flood, the destruction of the northern kingdom in Sefer Melachim, the examples really are endless. Most of us have witnessed the following phenomenon. Someone suffers a life-altering event, let's say an illness, and then they recover. Religious folks tend to go in two directions. Either they lose their faith through that struggle, or part of their faith, and lessen their mitzvah observance, or they can become more devout. What thought processes underlie such responses? They both assume God's involvement in their life. The first feels abandoned, and the second wants to come closer, or feels that God has actually pulled them closer through that challenge. Do both or either of these responses have precedence in Jewish sources throughout the ages? These are some of the questions that Tanya and I want to discuss together and bring to you, hopefully in a way that will be relevant to us moderns, searching for a meaningful perspective on the challenges that we face in our lives. One distinction I want to make clear from the outset is the distinction between responses and answers. We don't have any answers. We will present a number of responses, of approaches for how to deal or how to think, how to process these difficulties in our life, and how we can conceive of God and our relationship with God in periods of struggle. But there are no answers to these questions. There is a reason why these have been questions that have followed us throughout the ages. But we both believe that in this current reality, post-Holocaust, living with our most modern magefa, with our most modern pandemic, And with illness being something that I don't know if we can statistically say is on the rise, but sometimes I really do feel that. We really believe that it's not only important, but it's actually an imperative that we talk about prisms, about ways to think about these issues so that we can engage with them with our minds and with our hearts in a way that brings God into our life and that brings us into full engagement with these questions without really avoiding them.
Yosefa, I think it's super important, the differentiation you've made between an answer and a response. When we talk about answers, and Elie Wiesel speaks about this a lot in his books, Elie Wiesel says an answer is a closing. It closes us off to the possibility of future, of addressing the question again in the future. It closes us off to a journey towards different paradigms. And when we take an answer, we've kind of boxed ourselves into a certain ending. And I think for this problem, the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, it's a perennial problem of humanity that begins from the moment Adam and Chava exit exit Gan Eden, exit the Garden of Eden. And I think that for us, speaking in the 21st century, we have to know, and especially with this very short 4-series podcast, where we can't possibly address every single different response, but we can certainly offer a few different responses that may work at certain moments in people's lives. So I think that's very important to emphasize that. I wanted to just bring in a certain metaphor that I think will be very helpful to us when we're debating this particular topic, not just in this episode, but also for the future episodes. And that metaphor is given to us by David Brooks. David Brooks is an American journalist, social intellect, somebody that writes a lot of different articles, and he writes a book called The Second Mountain. And in that book, it's kind of a half autobiography, and generally just speaking about suffering and life and ethics and morality. And in that book, he describes somebody's life, and he says very often when we go on the journey of living, we approach it through the metaphor of two mountains. He says we climb, very often in our lives, we climb the first mountain. And what's the first mountain? The first mountain is the mountain of personal goals. It's about worldly success. It's about career ambitions. It's about perhaps traveling in the right social circles. But there's something about that mountain that's transitory, and ultimately unsatisfying, right? And then we get to, at some point in our lives, and again, I think every single human being will meet at some point in their lives a season of pain and suffering, and that he calls the valley. And again, he says it doesn't necessarily always have to be in this order, but usually it is, that we fall from that mountain into the valley. And in that valley, we, for whatever reason it be, it can be anything. It can be a moment of real tragedy, or it can just be some kind of adversity that we perhaps have never faced before. And when we're in a valley, we're immersed in our grief, in our pain. And the question is going to be, how can we climb up that second mountain? And I think when we approach the question of suffering, of course, we're going to be looking at it from a religious and a theological point of view, because as religious Jews, both of us, and I'm sure a lot of people that are listening, perhaps, whenever we approach any problem in our lives, or whenever we approach any conundrum that we are existentially grappling with, we're always going to be looking at it from the prism of a religious perspective. But I think ultimately this is also a deeply human question. And this is how David Brooks describes it. He says that every human being at some point will be sinking or will be drowning, so to speak, in that valley. And the question that they have to ask themselves is how we can climb the second mountain. And the second mountain for Brooks is characterized by other-centeredness, by self-giving, by self-transcendence, right? Which is basically moving outside of the I, right? What Rabbi Sachs would call moving to the we. And I think what he says is that in the first mountain, if that's defined by happiness, the second mountain is defined by something far more transcendent, and he describes that as joy. But I think what we're going to address in these series of podcasts is exactly the question that he asked, which is, how do we move from the valley to climb the second mountain? Is there a way of doing that where we still are able to retain the gift? And I think it really is a gift in so many ways, the gift of our religious commitment, the gift of our religious framework. Are we able to still embrace those very, very important things in our lives and climb the second mountain out from the valley of suffering? So I think that's going to be a super important paradigm for us.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really important paradigm. And I wanted to add 2 points to that. One is that what is the suffering itself? Obviously, the death of a loved one or an illness or some other tremendous setback in life, or someone didn't get a position that they spent decades working for, or any of these, those are the disappointments. That's the challenge. But one aspect that I think is very important is that the suffering doesn't necessarily directly come as a result of that event. But what often creates the suffering is when our picture of how life is supposed to be is not met. When our expectation for reality is completely and utterly shattered. I mean, it's not the death itself. Obviously, the death is very, very painful, but it's well, how do I live my life without that person anymore? How could it be that someone who was that wonderful is now no longer in this world? How could it be that children, right, can God forbid be taken from their parents? Meaning it's not necessarily the event itself that shatters, but it's the expectation we had of how life was supposed to be, and then the reality that we see before us. And that's what throws people into the valley, meaning it's the event, but more than the event, it's how much it shatters their vision of how life was supposed to be. And these questions are important, impactful, and intense for any individual, but they take on additional significance for a religious person as well, because a religious person has God in that picture and believes that God's world is largely good, believes that God is just. And then when the world we meet is anything but that, or when we feel like we are meted out a life sentence that is incredibly difficult, unjust, and painful, then those questions not only take on the regular human level of difficulty, but they also take on a theological level. So that's just to break down the idea of what are we talking about even with suffering.
Yeah, I want to just add to that, which I think is very important. Two things again to circle back to the aims of the podcast. Number one, just to add to that, the idea of this chasm, so to speak, between the world as I expect it to be and the world as it is. And I just wanted to bring in also someone else who writes about this, Susan Neiman, who's a very well-known philosopher who writes about, she's actually Jewish, but she writes about, very much speaks about the notion of evil in philosophy. And in a book that she writes, Why Grow Up, she gives a perfect example, Yosefa, which I think, we can both, being young mothers, we can both identify with, that, for the first time, when does a child meet that exact chasm or that exact dissonance, so to speak, between the world as we expect it to be and the world as it is let's say, when your 5-year-old or 7-year-old probably comes home from school and says, the teacher, it's not fair, Emma, the teacher told me off and I didn't deserve to be told off, or I got a bad grade and I didn't deserve to get a bad grade. And basically what they're saying to you is, well, hold on a minute, I expect the teacher to be just and fair because that's what I've learned. That's what a teacher's meant to be. In the same way that we expect God, so to speak, to be fair and just and all good and all-knowing, etc., and benevolent. And when we come face to face with the reality, and the child comes face to face with the reality where that person or the reality of which they expected to happen doesn't, then they come home and they say to the parent, life isn't fair. It's not fair. And as a parent, our job is to actually turn around and say, yeah, you're right. Sometimes life isn't fair, and sometimes people are not what we expect them to be. And there is a very great distance between what we expect and what we want. And the question is how we're going to deal with that adversity. And I think in the same way, when we look at it, as adults on a theological level, and this is exactly what Susan Neiman talks about in her book, and which is actually called Why Grow Up, right? Which is exactly this idea. And she speaks about the idea that being grown up being a mature adult is exactly the ability to deal with the cognitive dissonance between the world as we expect it to be and the world that is. Are we able to grapple, to deal with, to climb the second mountain, again, bringing in David Brooks's metaphor, even though we know that the world isn't exactly what we wanted it to be. And it starts from a very, very young age. So I think, one of the aims of the podcast is to grapple with that chasm between those two things. And the second thing I wanted to bring in, which is another aim, is the idea of periphery theologies. We looked at, when we speak about Galut and that whole period of time, which was really framed in the rabbinic tradition within the idiom of reward and punishment, because Galut was a punishment, essentially.
Right? Exile was a punishment for our sins, which is the theology that comes through in all of Sefer Melachim and other.
Right, which I think, which hopefully we'll talk about when we look at the biblical background to it. But I think that idea has expanded greatly since the Holocaust and since the modern state of Israel. And generally, by the way, just with the postmodern consciousness where just our consciousness generally, or human consciousness, I think, has expanded. I think it's time to widen that scope and for us to, in the same way when you learn a Gemara, for example, and you learn a Braita that is just not applicable to the Gemara or isn't used in the end to bring down the halakha, and we say, why should we learn the Braita? And the answer they give is because at some point in the future, we may need to go back to that Braita. In the same way, I really believe that there are theological paradigms that are brought down to us, both in biblical literature and in rabbinic literature. And even, to be honest, in some of the liturgies, some of the prayers and various other midrashic literature, where we have put them for many, many years on the back burner, so to speak. And the question is, maybe it's time for us to refer back to them today, especially in a post-Holocaust, postmodern world, and today with the pandemic and everything else that's going on. And I think that's another aim for us. I think you'll agree, Yosefa, in the podcast for us to really tap into those periphery perspectives.
And I wanted to add one piece, and then we're going to jump right into our biblical discussion. But the one piece I wanted to add is another way to frame the second mountain of that we have to climb up after having been in the valley is I really often think about when anybody goes through something that completely just shakes them to their core or shatters them, that ultimately the pieces have to be put back together, have to be glued back together, and the cracks will remain, but they will be filled with other things, with meaning, hopefully with growth. And the reason why I give that metaphor, not only because it speaks to me deeply, but because for me, Tanya, one of my aims for this series is also to give language. If anybody here is listening and they are struggling right now, they are right now in a valley, one of the greatest gifts that someone can receive is language to describe what they're going through. And I know that in my life, when I was first hit with what I assume will be my first valley in life, although I know Bezrat Hashem, a long life, I assume there will be others. When I was first hit with that, one of my most vivid experiences, visceral experiences that I had for really the first time in my life was the experience of having no words. When I had never experienced in my life grief and mourning in the way that I did in a very intense way in that period of my life, I literally didn't write for over a year. Like nothing left my hands. I didn't have any words to speak. And so for me, one of my goals here is to provide language that if someone who's listening can identify with the metaphor, or certainly with one of the theologies we're going to bring forth, but even if the language itself is something that they can find cathartic, then in my mind, Tanya, we've done our work here. So that's one other piece that I also wanted to bring.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, Yosefa, and I think that's profoundly true. And I totally concur with you because of a few valleys I've had in my life. Some that people know about, some that people don't. And of course, there's a lot of private valleys that people go through. I totally agree that there's, and I think the fact that you cannot express what you're going through creates a sense of deep loneliness, deep loneliness. And I think one of the things we're going to be addressing, and I think one of the themes that we're going to be addressing, is the idea of how community and shared experiences and just being, and we're going to talk about that later. I hope we'll talk about that as we go on, throughout the series, just being in the presence of somebody else, even if they cannot understand, and even if you cannot express, just the presence of another being can alleviate a deep sense of loneliness that all of us feel when we're suffering. Because honestly, when you suffer, Yosefa, right? You don't feel as if anyone else in the whole world has been through what you've been through.
Yeah.
And that itself is part of the suffering. So I 100% think that's also really, really important for us to know that people who are listening, and again, if they're going through these things, to know that there is a community out there, maybe not exactly what you're going through, but even in rabbinic, even in Jewish theology, that there are many different ways of tapping into that suffering and finding comfort in some kinds of response.
There's obviously something so ironic about that. In my head, I always compare it to birth, right? Everybody grieves or experiences loss, and giving birth is one of the more universal experiences, but somehow whenever people go through it, you always feel extremely unique, extremely alone. And somehow that, and when one is ready to reach out from that valley or accept the hands that are reaching down to them, then we can come into an experience where we realize that, other people have been here as well. It doesn't all have the same shade, but other people have been here as well. So we, both of us, are here to say to whoever's listening, we've been there. And we also just want to be able to share these ideas and this language with anyone who needs it. So that's also, I'm sending out a prayer for these next few episodes. Okay. So let's jump right in. We want to begin with biblical sources. A discussion of what responses do we see in Tanakh? Is it what we expect it to be? Is it unexpected? We want to start a discussion there. And our next episode, please God, will go deeper into rabbinic sources, and we'll keep moving forward in history after that. First, I want us to just hear, I'm going to read a number of psukim, a number of verses, to hear what I've already sort of expressed as what seems to be definitely a main perspective that exists in biblical literature, and that is disaster, suffering as a punishment. We have it in a number of places. I'll read in two particular, the punishment of the flood of Parshiot that we have recently heard. This is from Breshit, Perek Vav, chapter 6. וירא אדוני כי רבת רעת האדם בארץ, וכל יצר מחשבות ליבו רק רע כל היום. God sees that man has done evil, that is their only occupation throughout the day. וינחם אדוני כי עשה את האדם בארץ, ויתעצב אל ליבו. And God regrets the fact that he has created man, and he is saddened in his heart. One of my favorite anthropomorphic verses in all of Tanakh. ויאמר אדוני אמחה את האדם אשר בראתי מעל פני האדמה, מהאדם עד בהמה, כי ניחמתי כי עשיתים. And God says, I will destroy man and animal that I created because I regret that I ever made them. Okay, you really can't get any clearer correlation between action and punishment. This is really, really the strongest connection we have. Another example that we have from Sefer Bamidbar, from the book of Numbers, chapter 25, where we have Am Yisrael who sin with the Midianite women, and we have the particularly egregious sin of the Nasi, of the prince of the tribe of Shimon, and Pinchas goes and famously kills him and her who are sinning together, possibly in a precarious situation, they are in the Mikdash and in some version worshipping Avodah Zarah. Vayal Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen vayakom mitoch ha'ida vayikach romach biyado. Okay, Pinchas sees Cosbi and Zimri worshipping Avodah Zarah, and he gets up with a spear in his hand, and he kills them. Vayidkor et shnehem v'teatzer ha'magefa me'al bnei Yisrael. And when they are killed, the plague stops. Okay, so again, a very clear correlation between those who are sinning, who are profaning the Mishkan, must die, and when they die, the plague can end. And so again, these are just two examples of dozens all throughout Tanakh. Another example in Sefer Amos, where we have the Nevuah of Parot Bashan, which is a derogatory name for the fat, luscious women of the north. There, in those times, those who were overweight were obviously living a frivolous and very ostentatious lifestyle, where they were able to eat so much. And what are their sins? Ha'oshkot dalim, Amos Perak Dalet, chapter 4. Ha'rotetzot avyonim, ha'omorot la'adonehem havia v'nishteh. Here we have that they are living a frivolous lifestyle, which seems to be bad in of itself, and they're also oppressing the poor. And God says, you will be punished for your sins. V'gam ani natati lechem nikyon shinayim b'chol arechem. You will have clean teeth, which is a wonderful biblical metaphor for being hungry. V'choser lechem b'chol mekomotechem. And then God says, not only will you be hungry, but the other also classical biblical punishment for sin. V'gam anochi manati mikem et hageshem. And you also will not have any rain. And so here again, a motif we're familiar with from Shema that we say every day. And in the continuation of the same prophecy in verse 9, Hiketi etchem b'shidafon uve'yirkon, and you will also be hit with plagues that will destroy your crops. Okay, and so the hunger and the lack of water, all of these will come as a result of your sins. You've mistreated others, and now you will be punished for your sins. And this is a pretty clear theology that comes through in a tremendous amount of sources throughout Tanakh. However, the book of Iyov, and also I believe the book of Eicha to a certain degree, bring us a different perspective. The book of Iyov, which Tanya, please, you'll expound upon more after, does not go down such a clear-cut route. Solutions are offered by the friends of Iyov, even by his own wife. But the book of Iyov does not end with quote unquote an answer or with any agreement of the responses that are offered by his friends. The book of Iyov ends on a much more amorphous note. I'm reading here just two psukim, one from Perek Lametet from chapter 39. When God says to Iyov, why do you even think that you can understand my world? Mizeh machshich etza b'milin b'li dat. Efu hayita b'yostei haaretz haged im yadata vina. It says, where were you when the world was created? Right? Do you possess that kind of divine understanding? And God, in again, this sweeping response to the tens of chapters which try and offer responses, real reasons why Iyov has suffered so much in his life. And God says, why do you think you can understand these things? How is that even possible? And Iyov responds later in chapter 42, Lachen higadati v'lo avin, niflaot mimeni v'lo ida. And he realizes in what's the most humble response, he says, I really can't understand. This is far beyond my comprehension. And this is already digging at a response that I think possibly speaks more. I can't speak for everybody, but I think it's an important response, again, that should exist out there. That certainly some of our also rabbinic history has also taken up this response of, I can't really understand. I can't pretend to draw an exact linear line of causality and response and punishment. It doesn't work that way. I don't possess the ability to make, maybe in Tanakh, our theological understanding and parshanut offered by the prophets, that is something that can be offered. But us individuals, we can't ever really offer that kind of understanding. I
wanted just to add in a couple of things about Iyov, which I think are important to point out, besides what you beautifully explained in terms of, which I really would think just giving us a dose of humility, in a sense, when we drop down from that first mountain and reach the bottom of that valley, it really humbles us. There's a sense of, our hubris, which perhaps dominated at the top of the first mountain, has been shattered completely. And we suddenly realize that and by the way, I think that mankind as a whole over the last 2 years since Corona has, in some senses, also experienced that on a global level, that, we were the pinnacle of scientific research and R&D and all the various things that we were doing. And perhaps not being able to respond to this virus and not knowing how to respond to this virus and sort of grappling in the dark has really given us a dose of humility, or should have given us a dose of humility. I think that that's what we see in those responses from Eov after he's suffered. But I think, and to me, one of the greatest messages of the book of Eov, and perhaps why it becomes, in your words, what you said to me previously, a biblical joker. And I think it's such a great metaphor, this idea of Eov being the biblical joker, because if we think that reward and punishment is the only framework in which to assess suffering and evil, Eov comes and shatters that illusion, because at the end of the book, God turns around to Eov and says to him, tell your friends that they need to bring a sin offering. They were wrong in what they said. And what do we know the friends of Eov say? The friends of Eov want to blame Eov. The entire time they come at the beginning and they sit with him, but then they basically start inquiring of him, what did you do wrong? You must have done something wrong. And they say to him again and again and again, you must have done something wrong. You must have sinned. Otherwise you wouldn't be suffering in this way. And Eov insists he's not done anything wrong. And at the end of the book, Eov is, God justifies Eov's response and says, Eov, you were right and your friends were wrong, and they need to bring a sin offering because of that. So I think that part of the book of Eov is to shatter the classic refrain of divine reward and punishment, and to say it doesn't always work that way. There are circumstances in which, reward and punishment are not the only reason for suffering and evil in the world.
I think that this is also an important moment to point out that there may be a difference that has to be made, and we would need to write new doctorates to figure this out, but there might be a difference that needs to be made in Tanakh between national sin and punishment versus individual, meaning that it is one thing to point out the cause for suffering on a national level and create that direct line between them. And it is something entirely different to do that in the face of an individual. It's painful. It's perhaps wrong. And I think that, and again, we would need to collect more answers about this on an individual level. But when you read through Eov, you see how much that theology is being resisted. And I wonder, is it just because Eov wants to present a different paradigm of thinking, or is it also because we have to differentiate between speaking about the Northern Kingdom and how a prophet needs to rebuke them versus that all might be true, but when someone from the north would come to you and is suffering and they've been exiled, do you look at them and say, well, you sinned, right? And that individual, by the way, may never have even sinned. They may not have been someone in the north who, I'm going back to my example from Amos, they may not have been someone who actually was evil to the poor, who took advantage of the poor. And so it could be that our responses, even from a biblical perspective, need to be different when we are addressing the nation versus when we're addressing a person and their individual suffering.
So it's interesting, Yosefa, and I know that you wanted to bring Eicha, and if you look at the book of Eicha, the middle chapter, which is chapter 3, and Dr. Yael Ziegler talks about this in her new book. Chapter 3 is an oddity in the book. It's longer than the other chapters. It doesn't speak about the national, it speaks about the individual. And it's very interesting because in the other chapters, we really go along the refrain of divine reward and, sin and punishment.
Sure, it's the national destruction of the temple and exactly. National sin that brought that about.
Exactly. And it's Jerusalem crying, etc., etc. But chapter 3 describes the individual pain and existential wretchedness of suffering, and it's very different. It's very, very different, and it's posed differently. The language is different. The sentiment is different. And I think that's exactly what you're saying, that this differentiation between the national and the personal, the national and the individual, is also going to be very, very important when we're talking about the question of evil, the question of suffering.
Yeah, and I'll even add that if I can bring in just one idea also that Dr. Ziegler brings, is that, and again, this will require a complete analysis of Eicha, which we're not going to do right here. But when you read through Eicha, it really resists a simple solution for the problem of suffering. And it does not deny that injustice really is everywhere. But at the same time, the speaker of Eicha does not agree to leave God out of the picture, meaning it really, Eicha in many ways brings that struggle to the fore without giving the answer. Meaning the conclusion is certainly that God is still here and God is with us. However, the suffering, the national suffering, has also created intense individual suffering, which is what you are bringing in Perek Gimel in chapter 3. And so I do believe that Eicha and Iyov, if we can talk about periphery theologies, I'm not really calling Iyov and Eicha periphery books, but they're not the national histories of Shmuel and Melachim. And so those two books, I think, are books that within the biblical corpus do need to be looked at because they do have something else to offer. And of course, it depends how you read them, and different readings abound. But I do think that on this particular question of how do we approach evil, that they have a different shade to offer to this question than other more classic texts that I brought earlier.
100%. I agree with you on that. So I think that I'd love to just look at one particular narrative. And it's this narrative, interestingly, I mean, I actually don't think this is the first narrative that grapples with the problem of evil, because I think that begins even when Adam and Chava exiled from the Garden of Eden, and we're not going to look at that right now. But there is this idea that I think already exists in the Torah very early on in the narrative of Cain and Hevel, where we see that God does not come down to explain or justify. In fact, I think he rarely, if ever, in Tanakh comes to explain or justify himself or why he's doing a particular act or acting in a particular way. But I want to just share with you how I read the story of Cain and Hevel, because I think this is the first time that we hear a divine response or a divine teaching about how humans can face adversity. In other words, again, going back to that metaphor, how can we begin to climb that second mountain? And I just want to share the actual text because I think it's very important to see in the Pesukim. So we're in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 3. Vihimi ketz yamim. And I just want us to think about for a second what's going on. If you remember, we have Cain and Hevel. These are the two sons of Adam and Chava. And Cain is born first, and when Chava names him, she names God. She says, God has given me this wonderful person. And Hevel is just called Hevel. And Hevel is, we know, like nothingness, or, as Rabbi Sachs translated it, a breath, right? It's almost nothingness. And Cain takes over the family business. He works near his parents. Hevel goes and he's a shepherd far away. And Cain essentially has everything. He's born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He has everything that he ever wanted. And one time, he wants to tick the box. He wants to be that good boy. And he brings he decides he's going to bring a sacrifice to God. So and in the process of time, he comes and he brings a sacrifice to God. And Hevel, his younger brother, as younger brothers do, follows and copies him, and he also brings and Hashem lifted up Hevel's sacrifice. But Cain's sacrifice, he doesn't lift up. And Cain got very, very angry, and his face fell. And God says to Cain, why are you getting angry, and why is your face falling? Now, again, I remind you of that metaphor I used of the child that comes back and says to the parents, right? It's not fair. The teacher wasn't fair to me, right? This is the first time in his life that Cain has faced some kind of adversity, some kind of rejection. He's never faced this before. And there's no explanation for it. Right. And that's what's the key here. He doesn't understand why. Why did God not lift up his sacrifice? See, everything has worked in his favor. He was the first one that brought it. Again, we have, because of this very this very clear gap in the text, meaning why does God lift up Hevel and not lift up Cain? So the Mefarshim, all of the commentators come and they bring various reasons why it would be that God would have done it. But I think the key to the text is exactly, or I should say the message of the text is in the silence. The message of the text is exactly the idea that there is no reason, or the reason why is not important. What is important is how we're going to respond to adversity. How am I going to respond to rejection? How am I going to respond when life doesn't work the way that I want it to? Or in other words, how we had posed it, Yosefa, right? How am I going to respond when my reality or my expectation of reality doesn't match what my reality actually is? And here we have the key. And it comes in verse 7. Hello, Imtetiv. Hashem turns around to Cain and says, why is your face fallen? Hey, hello, this is life. It's going to happen. You're going to face injustice and things are going to not always work in your favor. But he gives him what I believe to be one of the keys to living as a human being in a world that always is going to serve us some kind of injustice. Hello, Imtetiv se'et. It's very difficult, it's a very ambiguous pasuk, even more so when we try to translate it. But I'm going to just translate it really, I think, at the most basic level. If you make good, and again, we don't know what's going to be lifted, but what I'd like to suggest here is, so the commentaries say that your sacrifice will be lifted, but I'd like to suggest that it works on the idea of, because in the previous pasuk we just finished, his face fell, and the way that I want to read it is, you will lift your face up. If you are able to make good of a situation in which you don't understand why you've been dealt the hand that you've been dealt, you don't understand why your reality isn't living up to what it should. But if you are able to make good of that situation, you will lift your face up. Your face will be able to show a countenance to others and to yourself that will allow you to move forward or to climb that second mountain. But, says God to Cain, if you do not make good, sin will always be crouching at your door, and you will be drawn towards it. We all know that it is easier to play the victim than to take agency. It is easier for me to complain than it is for me to say a good word. We know that that is where we are drawn as human beings. We have that as our nature. And God turns around to him at the end and he says, the only person that is in control is you. You are the one that can rule over yourself. You are the one that can control how you choose to react to your situation. Edith Egger, who is a very well-known writer who writes a book called The Choice. She was a Holocaust victim, went through the most unimaginable horrors in the Holocaust. And her book is called The Choice because she said, at every single given moment, I had the choice to be a victim or I had the choice to take agency of my life. And I believe that that message is one of the first messages that God himself gives to mankind through Cain. And that's what I see here. So I'm saying less important is the reason or the explanation or the trying to understand. Perhaps going back to Eov, I don't understand. But how am I going to respond? How am I going to act? How am I going to make good of a situation that I have no control over? And the only way we can do that is by choosing how we respond to it.
So I want to just add a few nuances that really I was thinking about when you were speaking, is that we will try and bring to the fore here a number of responses, meaning it's not just going to be, I don't understand what happened, I don't get it, and what do I do now? We will go deeper into that mess of a place. We will try and make some order of it. But I do want to say that I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but when he says that you need to make good or make best of your situation, we're not speaking here glibly about look at the glass half full, because I have to say I know you didn't mean that, so I just wanted to clarify that we don't mean a cheap glass half full positive psychology, which is a great thing. I'm just saying that's not what you're getting at. What we're getting at here is that one does need to recognize that they have suffered. You do need to give yourself space to grieve over the world view that you've lost, or obviously, and again, in addition to the person or your own personal loss or whatever it may be. But once you have given respect to that place of loss, or sometimes it can be before, in the case of obviously someone who's in this situation, again, unimaginable, like the Holocaust, or in some sort of very difficult moment where they have to make a choice at that moment. But of course, there's a space that needs to be allowed for the suffering, but the question is, what does one do with that suffering? Do they let it swallow them whole, or do you figure out how to emerge from that space? And that is what I think you mean when you speak about doing good, meaning when someone wants to make best and to lift their face, it doesn't mean take that sad, take that frown and turn it into a smile. But after we've given, and respected that frown, that we then figure out how to move forward in an impactful way and be the agent of our own journey.
Totally. So funny, as you were speaking, I was thinking about Sheryl Sandberg's book, Option B, which I think is very pertinent to our discussion right now.
A must read for anybody grieving.
And we'll hopefully put a reading list together from the books we've mentioned. In her Option B, Sheryl Sandberg, who was the CFO of Facebook and lost her husband very tragically, at a very young age, and left with 2 young kids. And she speaks about the idea of living an option B life. It's not ideal, but she speaks about this idea of post-traumatic growth, that the trauma is always going to be there. You're never going to get past it. You're never going to get over it. But can we grow from it? And I think that's what we're talking about here. When we say making the best, not making the best of a bad situation, it's growing with the trauma next to me all the time. And I think that's really part of it. And I have to say, and here I wanted to also bring in one more, I think, important distinction, that as human beings, we generally have a tendency towards 2 things, I think, anyway. And I certainly think I've seen this a lot more over Corona, over the pandemic. One is certainty. We like certainty. We like to know what lies ahead for us. We like to be certain of, it can be our environment, of our time, of what's going to be, of how things are going to pan out. And the other thing that we often tend to do, especially when we're suffering, or especially when someone else is suffering, we tend to blame. Very often you'll hear someone say, oh, he died from cancer. Oh, that's terrible. How old was he? He was in his 80s. Oh, did he have cancer for a long time? Yes. Oh, and he was a smoker. Oh, yeah. Oh, well, shame. What we're doing then is we're almost finding, we're using these 2 things, blame and certainty, because we're saying, okay, well, he was a smoker. So, obviously that's good. And that must have led to cancer. We boxing things into certain categories. When we discuss suffering, when we talk about suffering, when we talk about corona, when we talk about many other things, and justified sometimes, right? We very much try to blame someone else. If someone's suffering, if we're suffering, very often we see with children, if they do something wrong, they try and blame somebody else. The very first in Gan Eden, they cover themselves up. Each person's blaming somebody else. There's a lot of blame, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of trying to hold on to certainty. When we suffer a trauma, as you said, it's shattering, right? It's fragmenting. And therefore what we do is we cling on to certainties. We cling on to something that will remain steady for us. Sometimes that can be our religious dogmas. Sometimes that can be things that we know we're going to hold us and continue to hold us. But the problem with doing that is the worst thing about that, I think, and certainly about the blame. And often the holding on to the certainties comes with the blame, because when we hold on to certain religious dogmas or certain religious frameworks, it can lead, and we very often hear, unfortunately, religious leaders blaming certain events or certain tragedies, on the sins of certain groups. And by the way, it's not just particular to Judaism. In Christianity, you see that a lot as well. The worst thing about that, and here I think is one of the key things that we're trying to say, and it goes back to what we said at the beginning: when we suffer, we're alone. The worst thing about that, worst thing about blame, and sometimes about holding on to certainties, is that it doesn't ease the suffering of the other. It ends up making it worse. For example, we go back to the book of Eov. Eov's wife, who, by the way, also suffered, lost her children, but she turns around to Eov and says to him, curse God and be done with it and die. She's holding on to her certainty that if he curses God, he's going to be punished and he's going to die. She's not being with Eov in his suffering. She's blaming him for his suffering. She's blaming others for his suffering or for her suffering. And what it does is, and Eov turns around and he says, you've not helped me. You're just making it worse. His friends are in the same way. Eov turns around and says, how is this helping me? And he says it a few times in the book. How is blaming me helping me in any way? Sometimes people want to hear platitudes. Again, and I think this is it's a very
fine balance. You really have to know who you're speaking to.
Exactly. It's a very, very great area. But there are very often times, and I think when someone is in the immediate period of suffering, platitudes and explanations can make one's suffering even worse, because the person then feels even more lonely. You really don't understand what I'm going through. You really don't understand what I've been through or what I'm going through. And here, to me, this is the litmus test. The litmus test is when we're discussing all of these paradigms, to me, one of the major things is, does your explanation ease the suffering of the sufferer, or does it make it worse? And when Eov, the only time we see that his suffering is eased is after God comes down to him. And this to me was like, when I suddenly realized this, it was like mind-blowing, that at the end of the book of Eov, God comes down and he takes this on what I call this magical mystery tour of the cosmos, right? He takes him on all around and shows him, he says, where were you when I created the world? And he takes him and sees all these sea monsters and giants and whatever it happens to be. And at the end of it, Eov seems to have been in some way, he seems to have been comforted. And I think, why is that? And the only explanation that I can find is that God is the only person who comes and doesn't offer platitudes or explanations. He just comes. And the fact that there can still be an encounter between man and God, even after everything Eov has been through, is in and of itself a comfort. Is in and of itself, God's presence has created a makom, right? And that's another word for God, right? A place, a space, a holding.
Right. In psychology, we often talk about the idea of holding, right? A lot of times people will go to therapy, and it's not necessarily even for some, obviously they'll also gain insight, and that itself has a healing aspect to it. But sometimes it's that they literally need a space at which they can unpack and put all that difficulty and pain there, and that it be held. And that for that hour of the week, that there's nobody who is going to try and make it better, or say something that I'll even use the word is stupid. Okay. Meaning no one is going to say anything that will make that hole even bigger, but just to have that space there that is going to hold the questions, that's going to hold the suffering, that's going to hold the unending pain. And I think that exactly is what you're describing with Eov, meaning God holds Eov with him. He holds him. And obviously sometimes we also mean physical touch, but he holds that question with him without offering necessarily even a response. And so I think that that's a really important piece also as we're winding down the episode. And we will continue on with more responses themselves. But sometimes the most important response, even theologically, Tanya, is what you're saying. Sometimes even the most important theological response is to hold somebody in their suffering, and that there may not be any kind of explanation that can be offered, but that certainly in the immediate aftermath, and sometimes more than that, that people need their suffering held. They need to know that it's not grotesque. They need to know that it's not scary and too intense for the world around them, but that there is some place they can go where that those questions and those quandaries and those and the emotional rawness of what they're experiencing can just be there without it being a nuisance to somebody else in the world.
Yeah, so I really think that is such an important idea. And to me, and I think this is something we need to define, is that when we offer someone answers, and here I'm really honing in on the difference between the answer and the response. But when we offer someone an answer or an explanation, it can often be more painful than the pain they're enduring. And I think when we talk about creating meaning from suffering, and we're going to continue this as we go on through the episodes, but when we talk about creating meaning from suffering, I think that one of the most important insights is that ultimately the only person who can create meaning, that can give meaning to suffering is the individual who's gone through that suffering, because they are the only one that understands what they've been through, what alleviates their suffering. So again, it goes back to the litmus test. Does our explanations, our answers, our responses, does it alleviate the pain of the person, or does it increase the pain of the person? Only they are able to know that. And therefore, only they can create the meaning for themselves out of their suffering. So I think
I'll even just interrupt with a small example. Is that often something that my husband and I speaking about, and I also try and teach my children, which is always a more difficult goal. But we talk about helping. It's really the same thing, even if it's just a small household help. And I'll have asked for something and they say, well, I didn't clean everything up from the table, but I put something away on the other side of the house. And I was like, that's great, but that isn't what I asked you to do. And so that's helpful, but it's not the help I wanted right now. Because what I really wanted now was what I asked you to do. And that's not what was done. And it's a very difficult differentiation, certainly for children to know. And we're talking here on a much grander level of emotional differentiation, of knowing what it means to, only the person themselves can define what it is to help them. And obviously when people are able to speak and say, I need a meal once a day, right? Or whatever it might be. If someone is able to articulate what they need, then that's phenomenal. But obviously people, a lot of times when they're in a difficult time, as we said before, they're not always in possession of those kinds of words or that kind of clarity. So I think that that's a really important point, that only the person themselves who is suffering can define, when meaning has been made or that has been alleviated. Yeah,
and I want to just add one other thing in to go back to the notion of makom. I think in the same way that only the sufferer can define the meaning that they need, I think in the same way only the sufferer can define the relationship that they can or want to have with the divine, with God, through their suffering. And it reminded me when we were talking about makom, of the idea of the Akedah, where again, and this goes back to what we began with, really, when you said that very often there's not a language that one can, that we lack very often when we're suffering or we're going through painful experiences, we lack the language with which to express ourselves. So it reminded me very much of the Akedah, where again, exactly what we're talking about happens to Abraham. The reality of what he thought, or his believed reality, comes face to face with the reality. The cognitive dissonance for him at that moment when he's asked to sacrifice his son is so great, because between what he believed he was and between what is. And all we hear from him, the entire narrative, is Hineni, 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 right? We don't hear any other words because he physically cannot express what he's going through. So one of the things that we hear in the text is when he looks up, he sees Hamakom Mirachok. And we always take that to be the mountain. But to me, that's God. Because at that moment where we have
Hamakom being God.
Hamakom being God, right? Being that space. That space where God holds him, which is what he was used to. He was used to the intimacy that he had with the divine until that moment. That's been ripped away. And part of the journey up the mountain for Abraham, to me, is the journey back to the makom, back to that intimate space. Because when we are suffering, and I really want to finish with this because I think it's so, so important for people to hear this, that when we suffer or when we go through some kind of personal adversity, and perhaps over the last year and a half, all of us have gone through some kind of theological and personal adversities. I think it's super important to hear that sometimes hamakom rachok, God can feel distant, that we don't know how to relate to God, to divinity, to religion, to everything that we've believed until now is all of a sudden taken away from us. And I think it's okay to say that mountain, that space, that divine intimacy is far from me at this particular moment. It's not that it's disappeared, and it's not that we're never going to get back to it. It's just that at this particular moment in my suffering, in my pain, in facing my adversity, I can't use the same intimate language. I can't pray in the same way. I can't speak to God in the way that I used to. And that's holding space. It seems to be very far from me right now. And I think if we interpret that narrative of the Akedah in that way, it gives us hope that if even for Abraham that is the case, then for us it's also okay for us to sometimes know that we will get back to that space, that intimate divine human space. But perhaps at that moment of suffering, it's just not a possibility. So I think that itself is also super important.
So just to summarize our conversation up until now, Tanya, is that basically we've discussed the dilemma itself and the importance of addressing the dilemma in the world we're living in at this current moment. Our goal really is to bring theologies that have been marginalized over the years, sort of move away from the sin and punishment model that still, if it still speaks to you, then that's great. But to bring other theologies to the fore that we think may be meaningful for people. Within the small biblical study of the verses that we saw, there definitely is a mainstream approach of sin and punishment, but there are other theologies that are also there. There are other theologies, as you've brought in the story of Cain and Hevel, where every individual is the agent of their own change, and that we have the ability to take things and to make good out of whatever we've been given. And Eicha, which certainly does not deny the pain that exists and does not deny the pain of the individual suffering, even in the face of national tragedy. And the book of Iyov, which, as we said, is really the biggest joker out there, he sort of laughs in the face of all explanations. All responses really pale in comparison to the reality of how large this question actually is. And so even within the biblical corpus, there really is a wide variety. There's a wide variety of responses. What we're going to look at in the coming episode are rabbinic ideas that maybe we're familiar with, maybe we're not familiar with in the way that we're going to speak about them. But ideas that do exist in rabbinic texts, both from the Talmud and from Middle Ages and later on, in response to these questions of how we process difficulty, struggle, and disease, and how we can relate to those struggles and try and fit them into a worldview that feels right for us. So stay tuned for the coming episode.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Thank you to the entire Matan team for their input. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, and Matan's website, and write us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.